Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner, co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Church of Austin. We're at 4700 Grover Avenue. Our forums are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. For more information, you can go to our website at www.austinuu.org. And now, Douglas Bauer will introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Bonnie. I want to start off by repeating something that we've heard before, which is part of our First Unitarian Universalist Statement of Values for this church, which is the First UU Church of Austin is an intentionally hospitable community where all people are treated with respect and dignity. And with that as a preface, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. From Equality, Texas, we have Chuck Smith and Lisa. Are you going to talk today too?
A little bit, yes.
Yeah. And Lisa Scheps. I hope I got your last name correct. Chuck is the executive director, and with help from Lisa, we'll discuss the current proposed legislation in the 83rd session of the Texas Legislature and political climate for LGBT Texans. Issues that will be covered will include marriage equality, employment non-discrimination, supplemental birth certificates, insurance non-discrimination, and more. Provide a little background on Chuck. He works with the agency's board of directors and staff to implement Equality Texas' mission to end public policy discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity expression. Chuck first volunteered for Lobby Day at the Capitol back in 2003, and he had an opportunity to lobby his old 8th grade social studies teacher. Became an immediate lobby junkie, and Chuck joined the staff on a full-time basis in December 2003. Named executive director in 2005 and interim director in 2010-12. He was officially became the executive director in November of 2012. Chuck is a Austin native, has a BBA from University of Texas Becomes School of Business, and a member of the Austin Travis County Hate Crimes Task Force and serves as a co-chair of its response work group. I don't have a biography for Lisa, so I'll have to let you do a mini introduction when you speak. Okay. With that, I'll turn the floor over to who wants to speak first.
We're gonna tag team.
Okay.
My name is Chuck Smith. Thank you for having us here today. I am the executive director at Equality Texas. This is my operations manager, Lisa Scheps. I'll let her give you her short bio.
Okay. Because we want to do that. I'll just let you guys a little bit know about my background. I moved to Austin about 11 years ago. I was part of a group of 5 people that began an organization called Transgender Education Network of Texas that works towards advocating for the gender diverse Texans in our state, which is the part of the Equality Texas mission, which refers to gender identity. So that's some of the stuff that we do. I have a background in theater, having worked on Broadway, off-Broadway, off-Broadway, and tours and stuff like that. And came to Texas 10 years ago, got out of theater and started working on advocacy. And at the same time, Chuck started volunteering for for Equality Texas. I also volunteered at the same time, and so we actually started working in the organization.
We are. We're about to celebrate our 10 years with the organization, and I think our first, or certainly both of our first involvement with the organization was at our lobby day at the Capitol, which Equality Texas holds one every 2 years during the legislative session. As you sort of mentioned in the introduction, I had never heard of the organization. So I want to start with you. And how many of you have never heard of Equality Texas? Hopefully you will know more about us by the end. Equality Texas is 24 years old. Next year will be our 25th birthday. We're looking forward to having a big celebration then. I wish we didn't need to exist, but we probably will still need to exist next year. The mission statement, actually our vision statement goes right along with the guidelines that that Douglas talked about in terms of the values of this church. Our vision statement actually is that we envision a state where all Texans are treated equally with dignity and respect. Our mission statement is to end discrimination. We advocate and lobby for the elimination of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. 10 years ago, I had never heard of the organization, and I am a native of Austin, but I had been living in San Antonio, and I was actually attending a Catholic seminary. I had a goal of being a lay Catholic hospital chaplain. And the program director knew my history, knew my background, knew that I was a gay man, knew that I had been in a relationship for 17 years, knew that my partner had recently died, and that there had been a really strong spiritual component to that journey. And so I do have a degree in business, but I had started out in pre-med and always had a desire to work in a hospital environment. And through the process of death and dying, discovered that it was something that didn't scare me. And was interested in being a chaplain. Well, I lasted 2 weeks because while the program director was fine with it, the faculty had a hissy, and ultimately the best that they could propose as a solution was for me to go in the closet. And I was 40-something years old at the time, and that was not going to be an option. So the day that I decided to withdraw from the Oblate Seminary in San Antonio, the house that I was renting, the breaker box exploded and the house caught fire. And so I sort of took that as my sign that I was supposed to come back to Austin, which I did, and shortly thereafter went to my first ever Equality Texas Lobby Day, and did have the opportunity. At Lobby Day, you go as a team. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on, because we would love to have a team from First UU at our Lobby Day. But you go around and you spend the day in a small group as a team. And one of the people that my team got to meet with was State Representative Carter Castile. She's now retired from the state legislature, but at the time she was a state representative for the Hill Country. In 1969, she was my 8th grade social studies teacher. And I wasn't out when I was in junior high. And so 10 years ago, two of the things that, as an organization, that we were actively working on were bullying in schools. And at the time, we were always trying to defend legislation that would have prohibited gay people from serving as foster parents. And so she and I got to have this face-to-face discussion that was no longer between an 8th grade teacher and an 8th grade student, but between two adults. And she talked a lot about will and grace, but she also talked about the fact that in her life outside of the Texas legislature, she had stopped teaching and had gotten a law degree, and she was a family practice lawyer. And she talked about the fact that she had learned that not all families look alike, and that she had grown to appreciate that love was based upon, or that families were based upon love and caring, and taking care of one another and taking care of children and adults. And so we had this, this extended conversation about, she told me that she couldn't support us on our position on the freedom to marry because if she did, she wouldn't have a parking place, which is true, because later in that legislative session, as a former public school teacher, she was an adamant opponent of vouchers for private school. And she opposed the speaker at the time, and she ended up without a parking place because he got somebody to run against her and beat her. But the whole experience showed me the power of lobbying. And I think most people, when they hear the word lobbying, they think of smoke-filled rooms and people that get paid high salaries to bribe people or stuff like that. And that's not really what it is. Lobbying is merely seeking to influence a decision maker based on a personal story and a personal conversation. And so, my conversation with her on that first visit was, I wasn't out when I was in the 8th grade, and yet at the same time, there was no legislation that if somebody wanted to slam me into a locker, that she could have turned and looked the other way. There was nothing. There were no anti-discrimination or anti-bullying laws, and so it was an empowering day for me because I saw firsthand that people that are elected to represent people, they write the laws, and they write the laws based upon the feedback that we give them. And And that day basically kind of changed my life. And since then, like one of the first things then that I got involved with as a volunteer, actually before I was an employee, was, as I said at the time, that there was legislation pending that would have banned gays and lesbians from serving as foster parents, from even applying. And I had a friend that worked at a foster care agency, and actually that session, in order to appear as so that they were not just gay bashing, they had written that the law was drafted to where any unmarried person would be prohibited. So no single people would be allowed to be foster parents. And I had a friend that worked at an agency and asked her how many of your foster parents would be affected if you have to be married. And the answer was fully 2/3 of their foster parents were single, mostly women, but they were single parents. So she invited me to this foster care agency, and we organized our own little mini lobby training, and asked these people if they wanted to come to the Capitol and talk to state representatives about how this legislation basically would take their children away. And I think we had 16 mothers. Most of them had never been to the Capitol before. And we spent the day, and some of them brought their foster children with them. And we went from office to office, and they talked about, this law will pull my kids out of my home. And it was, that was the truth, and it was a real story. Well, that's what lobbying is. That legislation never passed. It's never come up again since 2007. And part of why bad legislation like that doesn't happen is real people get up and stand up and say and talk about what's right and what's important and what should be. So for those of you who have never heard of us, we work to try and eliminate policies that discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity and expression. And there's not a lot in Texas law that prevents any of that. How many of you think that it's against the law in Austin, Texas, to be fired from your job for being gay? No, how many of you think it's against the law in Austin that to fire someone for being gay, for no other reason than being gay? It is. In the city of Austin, it is. How about if you're in Round Rock? Georgetown, Maynard, Elgin. There is no state law in the state of Texas that prohibits discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation or gender identity expression. The city of Austin has a municipal ordinance, and so it is against the law in the city of Austin. However, the maximum penalty for violating that is a $500 fine.
Meaning you don't get your job back. If you're fired based on your sexual orientation and gender identity in a municipality like Austin, what you get is the highest misdemeanor fine, which I believe is $200, but maybe $500. But you don't get your job back.
So, which points to the need for, and Austin is not, the cities of Austin, Dallas, and Fort Worth are the only three municipalities in the entire state who have municipal ordinances that prohibit such discrimination for all employment in those cities. The cities of Houston and El Paso have ordinances that cover if you work for the city of Houston or if you work for the city of El Paso. The city of San Antonio doesn't have an ordinance, but it's like the mayor's current policy that they will not discriminate in city employment. So there's definitely a need for a statewide law that protects workers in the workplace just as people are protected from bias based on their race, their religion, their national origin. Part of the uphill battle with this is that a majority of people think it's already against the law. Most people assume in this day and time that you can't fire someone just because they're gay, and they think it's already or transgender. But it's legal at a statewide level in Texas. There's also no federal. This type of legislation is also pending at a federal level. So This legislative session, employment non-discrimination is one of the two high priority issues for Equality Texas in the current legislative session. One is employment non-discrimination. The other one is accurate birth certificates for adopted children. And I'll give you a little background on that. Every child who is adopted upon the order, a judge's order of an adoption decree, that child gets what's called a supplementary birth certificate. And the supplementary birth certificate replaces the birth certificate that the child received at birth and replaces the names on the original birth certificate with the names of the legally adoptive parents. The problem in the state of Texas is that by statute, by law, the form is limited to one person who shall be male and shall be the father, and one person who shall be female and shall be the mother. There are over 37,000 children in the state of Texas who, by legal adoption decrees, either have two mothers or two fathers. And none of those children can get both their parents' names on the birth certificate. And literally, when the process happens, they have to pick which parent's name goes on the birth certificate. Now, the problems that causes is, as you may know, a child's birth certificate is, on some levels, it's like the driver's license or passport equivalent of an adult. It's what children use to identify who they are. The birth certificate also is the document that identifies who their parents are. So these 37,000 children don't have a piece of paper to present when they register for school. They don't have an accurate certificate that they present for medical care, to get a passport. So there's like this never-ending cycle of every time that a child would normally present a birth certificate, they don't have one that reflects both of their legal parents. We have been working on this legislation for 6 years. We've gotten a hearing in committee every session. It tends to start really frosty, and people are like, "What are you people trying to pull?" But we might talk for 3 minutes on the subject, and then we turn it over to parents and children to talk about what it means. And by the end of that hearing, the members of the committee, ultimately, most of them, some of them don't, most of them come to a realization that the families that they're looking at might not look like their family, but they're really hard-pressed to deny that they're looking at a family. We were really hopeful. Over the last 18 months, we've been lobbying, working really hard, the members of the Public Health Committee, which is where this legislation has always gone. And we actually got to the point where we did have a majority of the votes on the members of this committee in order to get it out. So what do? They referred the bill to a different committee this session. It's not a totally hostile committee, but it's like starting over. It's like 6 years of work on working members and telling them the stories and getting them to the point where they were ready to do the right thing. And this session, the bill got referred to a different committee. So we're not giving up. There's work to be done. There are 9 people on this committee, so we have 9 new people that we need to convince of our story. But when you lead with the argument, or when you lead with the statement that every child deserves to have their parents' names on their birth certificate, not many people will disagree with that. And ultimately, this legislation, it's not so much a gay rights issue, it's a child welfare issue. And you come back to is every child should have their parents' names on the birth certificate, period. And the history of the legislation that changed it does sort of come back to a history of homophobia. Until 1997, the law read, "The supplementary birth certificate of an adopted child shall reflect the names of the parents." And in 1997, because they were scared, that's when they just added the words, one of whom shall be male and one of whom shall be female. All we're trying to do is to take that extra language that they put in 97 and go back to the logical statement of the birth certificate should reflect the names of the parents. So we're in the process of that and employment non-discrimination are our two highest priority issues. Employment non-discrimination legislation some form of it has been filed every legislative session for decades. The current wording of the legislation, this is also our 6th year using the same wording of this proposed bill, which every place in the Texas Labor Code where there's a list of classes to which bias motivated discrimination is prohibited, which is, it lists the class of race, religion, national origin. It would add the word sexual orientation and gender identity. So it's simply taking the prohibitions or the protections for employees that already exist based on discrimination based on race, religion, and other factors, and adding sexual orientation and gender identity to it. The author of that legislation this year, as well as this is the 3rd session in a row, is Representative Michael Villarreal from San Antonio. He's reporting to us that he is finding a more favorable reception to the legislation this year. In addition to us talking about it as a civil rights issue and a fair employment practices issue, we've also begun talking about it as an economic issue. And because the reality is that most major employers, not only in Texas but in the United States, this is a standard part of their employment non-discrimination policies. Businesses have already come to know that if they want to keep, hire, retain talented people, they need to welcome everybody who presents for the job, who has the skills and the ability to do it. And to not have employment practices that value diversity and value every employee based on the skills that they can bring to the workplace is not going to be good for their business. So we actually have our own microsite on this issue that is called equalityisgoodforbusiness.org, where we are seeking to highlight Texas businesses that have already adopted these practices. And they do so ultimately for the bottom line because it helps them make money, but they do it because employees come in all shapes, sizes, flavors, and colors. And companies know that if they want to do the best, want to either provide the best product, provide the best service, if they want to keep good employees, they need to be opening and welcoming and valuing diversity. So, the business world is way ahead of the state legislature on this issue, which kind of happens on a lot of the things that we're working on. This legislation, we will be in the same committee that we were 2 years ago, but it has a lot of new members. So we're in the process of, again, trying to tell our stories, which is where, you can all be an important part of this if any of these issues were to affect you directly, or even if they only affect you indirectly. If I say something as a gay man, it's the gay agenda. If a straight person, if an ally says it in a supportive way or fashion, people will listen to your words in a different way than if I were to say the same thing. And ultimately, I'm a strong believer in the idea that our work will succeed and our mission will be accomplished when most of the people doing the talking are not lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. That the laws will change when straight allies are telling lawmakers, you don't need to be afraid of this anymore. Can you just move on and do it already? And we're starting to see that. And so please leave here today knowing that your voices are incredibly important to the work that we do. Everyone's voices are important to the work that we do. Where we are this legislative session, those are the two top two topics. So far, I've been amazed at the the volume of bills that are being filed and what they're dealing with. So far, we have 13 good pro-equality bills filed in the legislative session, and only one bill that we are actively opposing. And that's a big change. In the 24 years that our organization has existed, up until 2007, we spent all of our time on defense. We were 100% of the time fighting bad bills. There was never any time to work on trying to pass good stuff. Since 2007, we have had the ability to work on good stuff. That's why I was saying, like, some of these, this is like the 6th year that we're working on these, because from 2007 till now, we've been able to try and advance good stuff. Prior to this year, all of that good stuff was only in the House of Representatives. There have never been any state senators file any good piece of legislation. This year, we went in with a goal of trying to have a Senate companion bill to every House bill that we were working. And I have been shocked and amazed at the response that we've gotten to where, well, you may have seen in the news, I mean, senators are filing civil union bills and marriage bills. That was I'm going to admit, that was their idea. I mean, they're like ready to rock and roll all of a sudden. The employment non-discrimination bill that Representative Villarreal has filed in the House, for the first time ever, there's a Senate version of that bill that's identical. The author of that bill is Senator Leticia Vanderputte. She's a state senator also from San Antonio, but is a very vocal advocate for protecting all workers in the workplace. The birth certificate bill is authored by Representative Rafael Anchia. He's a state representative from Dallas. This is his third session to author that bill. We don't have a Senate sponsor for that bill, but hopefully if we can advance it. From my perspective, I think the birth certificate bill is probably the one piece of legislation that perhaps has the best chance of moving the furthest. Hopefully we can have a hearing and get it favorably voted out of committee. I would like to believe that the Texas House of Representatives would be able to find a way to also buy into the radical notion that every child should have their parents' names on their birth certificate. And if we're able to get it out of the House, there are people in the Senate that are interested in helping us if we can get the bill to the Senate. The one piece of bad legislation that we are opposed to that has been filed, I'm just going to read this so I make sure I get it right. Here it is House Bill 360. It's authored by a freshman state representative. His name is Matt Krause. He is a new state representative from Tarrant County. And he has proposed a legislation that would withhold state funding from any public or private institution of higher education that requires student organizations to allow students regardless of status or beliefs. In other words, he wants student organizations, and actually if you read it, the details of it are that he wants student organizations to be able to discriminate based on race, gender, and sexual orientation. I'm hopeful that his bill is not going to go very far because I don't think it's going to be popular with very many people at all. But that is the type of bad legislation that still exists and that still comes up and gets filed. Some of the other stuff, of the 13 other bills that are pending, there is legislation filed that would prohibit discrimination in insurance. It deals with discrimination based on bias, which is different than, we're not talking about changing actuarial guidelines. I mean, insurance is based upon rates. Rates are based upon estimated risk, and that's a part of what insurance is. So we're not trying to change that. But the law would seek to prohibit discrimination that was solely motivated by bias. Excuse me.
For instance, I was unable to get. I had the means, I had the resources to get insurance. I tried to get private insurance as a transgender person. They said no. We said why? They said because you're transgender. And we had no recourse. And up until that point, or up until recently, I was the kind of person that only put into the system. I was very, very healthy, athletic. There was nothing physically or anything about me actuarially that would cause me to be a risk to that agency. They simply said no because I was transgender. And so bills like this would seek to help rectify that.
And unfortunately, Lisa's case is not atypical. It is virtually impossible for people who have a history of gender transition. It's impossible to get private insurance. If you work for a large company, or you might have access to a group policy, but for an individual to be able to obtain a private health insurance policy, it's simply not available for transgender people. And that's not based on actuarial guidelines. It's based on bias and discrimination. So this legislation would seek to prevent that. This is also a bill that we have both a Senate sponsor and a House sponsor, and they're high-powered people, which are hopefully give this legislation some oomph in this session. One of them is Senator Rodney Ellis, who's a state senator from Houston, and the sponsor on the House side is Representative Senfronia Thompson from Houston, who is the most senior female member of the Texas House of Representatives and is a great orator and champion for the elimination of discrimination. We can talk a little bit about marriage. Equality Texas does fully support the freedom to marry. It's not something that was high on our legislative agenda because given the current makeup of the legislature, it's not highly likely that such legislation would advance. However, within the last 2 weeks, we've seen, I think, a total of five bills or resolutions filed that would start the process of dismantling the discrimination that exists not only in the Texas Constitution but also in the Family Code. And what I'm trying not to make this complicated, but currently marriage in the state of Texas is restricted to the union of one man and one woman, and the state is prohibited from recognizing anything similar to it. So currently, you can't have domestic partnerships or civil unions or marriage for same-gender couples. Those restrictions are not just in one place, but they're in two places. In 2003, Texas enacted its Defense of Marriage Act, which is a statute that put these restrictions in the Family Code. 2 years later, in 2005, because having a law against it was bad enough, there was a Texas Marriage Amendment, which was a constitutional amendment that was approved by voters that put those same restrictions in the Constitution. So it's in two places. In order to ever get to a position where same-gender couples could either get married or have a civil unions, both of the restrictions in those places have to be dismantled. The legislation that has been filed within the last 2 weeks works on both of those places. There were House and Senate resolutions filed that, if passed, would take out the restrictions that are in the Constitution. It takes a 2/3 vote, which means we need 100 out of 150 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate for that to advance. If that were to happen, then it would still go back to, it would be another ballot measure, a statewide ballot. That would take out the restrictions in the Constitution. We'd still have them in statute. This past week, Representative Lon Burnham filed a bill that would repeal the Defense of Marriage Act and would allow for the freedom to marry in Texas. That one, to pass that, doesn't take 2/3. It just takes a majority. But even if that were to pass, it can't go into effect unless you also do the Constitution thing. So in order for any of this to happen, both the legislation that affects the Family Code and the legislation that affects the Constitution would have to pass. The reality is that that's not likely in this legislative session. But I think the good news is that the opponents of this, their first pushback is, we settled this in 2005, you lost, it's over. And our comeback and the truth is that things have changed since 2005, even in Texas, to where, people across this country have had their own personal evolution on where they stand with regard to whether or not same-gender couples can get married or should have some form of legal recognition of their relationships. And the changes that are happening in other states are also happening in Texas. And we have recently completed polling where we did statewide polling. Well, we did statewide polling in 2010. And we asked questions on 12 different issues. And all the questions, other than the two questions that dealt with the word marriage, had the majority support of Texans. The questions on marriage didn't. When we updated that poll this year, even the marriage questions have more support than the opponents. And those questions were whether or not people should be able to get married in Texas or whether or not Texas should recognize marriages performed in other states. And so even in Texas, Texans are changing their minds. And so the reality is that where people are now is different than 2005 when we had the constitutional amendment election. So I think lawmakers are starting to recognize that, and so that's why they're interested in filing this legislation, because it starts the process. Are we ready to go to a ballot measure? No, we're not ready to go to a ballot measure. It will take more groundwork. It will take having more conversations to make sure that people understand and will vote to take out the restrictions that got put in 2005. But it starts the process of having those discussions. For example, many of you, know that at the end of last year, voters in Maine finally voted to allow the freedom to marry. That process in Maine took 7 years and 2 statewide ballot measures. But throughout that whole period, there was organizing work on the ground throughout the state of Maine in order to talk to voters about why same-gender couples should have access to the institution of marriage just like everybody else. And so the filing of this legislation here, in many respects, is sort of the start of our multi-year program to try and work toward the freedom to marry here. At the same time, we're going to continue to actively being involved in things other than marriage, like employment non-discrimination, accurate birth certificates, non-discrimination in the workplace, non-discrimination in insurance, all the other 13 bills that don't deal with marriage that we're working on. Anybody have any questions?
Yes. Let's start here with Dr. Phil Richardson.
You know Tom Doyle, I'm pretty sure. He gave a talk to the forum last year on getting 2106 knocked down, and apparently the Supreme Court eventually decided it was illegal to have a sodomy law. The problem is, he said, it's still in the state constitution. How about the marriage thing? If the Supreme Court rules favorably in May or June of this year on gay marriage, do you think the Texas legislature will ever have the courage to fix the Constitution?
Right. Well, it is true that in the Lawrence v. Texas decision declared that Section 2106 of the Penal Code was unconstitutional. Unfortunately, that happened 10 years ago. The state of Texas has still refused to take that statute off the books. And it is occasionally used by untrained law enforcement officials to harass and demean gay people. There was a recent one in El Paso where 2 men kissed in a restaurant and they were kicked out, and the law enforcement officials that came cited this statute as being that being gay was illegal. Ultimately, which it's like no, they ended up suing, And ultimately, they ended up settling with the city of El Paso, but it cost the city of El Paso money because untrained law enforcement were enforcing an unconstitutional statute. For the first time ever, this is one of the bills that for the first time ever, we have a state senator who has introduced legislation this session to finally take that statute off the books. So that's a good sign. There will also be it hasn't yet been filed, but there will also be a similar legislation filed on the House side. And the senator's response is like there is no legal justification to have an unconstitutional statute on the books. It's unenforceable. It's only used to discriminate and harass people. It needs to go. Yes, the Supreme Court is going to be considering several cases that deal either with Defense of Marriage Act or with marriage. Everybody's just going to have to wait and see how that shakes out because the breadth or narrowness of an opinion, it could be all over the place in terms of each of the cases that are before the court deal with very specific legal issues, and so some of the decisions, even if they were to be ruled favorably, might only apply to California. Again, there are a multiplicity of issues that are in those cases, and we'll just have to see how broadly or narrowly the Supreme Court rules. There is potential there that it could have a broad effect. I think many people think that the decisions will have a narrow band and apply specifically to the specific cases or parts of the Defense of Marriage Act that are in the cases before the court.
I know you must have more questions, so raise your hands high. Okay, I'll get to you. And Douglas?
I'm relatively new in Texas. I moved here in 2005, so I'm not real familiar with the marriage amendment that was added to the Constitution. Is it possible to make civil unions legal at the state level without overturning the current Constitution?
It's not. The current restrictions both in the Constitution, the current restriction in the Constitution prohibits marriage or anything similar to marriage, and so that specifically was targeting civil unions. We do have a bill for that, though, this year. For the first time ever, a state senator has filed a bill that would create civil unions. Now, so his legislation, unlike the Representative Burnham filed a House bill that would provide for the freedom to marry. Senator Juan Hinojosa from McAllen has filed a bill that would partially repeal the Defense of Marriage Act to where it would take out to where it would leave the restrictions that marriage is limited to a man and a woman, but it creates and defines what a civil union is and allows for its existence. That bill, if it were to pass, it also cannot come into effect unless the constitutional restrictions are also removed. So anything going into effect will require the constitutional provisions to be changed. And then on the bill, the legislative side, there is both the civil union bill and a full marriage equality bill.
We have a question here. Would you say your name, please, and ask your question?
I go by Red. I actually have two questions. One for Linda and one for Chuck. For Linda, I was with Lisa.
Okay, I'm thinking of changing it to Linda.
So my question about the insurance thing that we're working on is whether the provisions in the ACA that stipulate non-discriminatory practices in the insurance markets, and whether that's going to be of assistance in this, or whether the language is not strong enough anymore. And then with the marriage provisions, historically it's been really, really difficult to remove anything from the Texas Constitution, which is why it's so long and rambling. And has it been attempted to go Hawaii's route and add instead a provision that says something to the effect of no provision which discriminates blah, blah, blah is going to be in effect? You know, all provisions except you can't discriminate based on race, creed, gender identification, sexual orientation, etc. have
I think I got your question.
Go first.
I do believe the Affordable Care Act would remove the limitations that are placed based on pre-existing conditions, and many times that's the basis for which people with a history of gender transition are denied, because they will say that that's a pre-existing condition. Unfortunately, that doesn't go into effect until 2014. That may help.
Yeah, and answer your question, I think the Affordable Care Act goes a long way to get rid of that, because what the Affordable Care Act in essence says is not only can nobody be denied insurance, it's required for you to have insurance. So, and with all the situations, the systems going in place, if it goes through, then I think that we would be okay in that regard. That being said, we know how contentious Obamacare is and how tenuous the Affordable Care Act is in its existence. So any kind of non-discrimination policy that we can put into law will only strengthen people of gender nonconforming, people that are gender nonconforming, to be able to get insurance.
And it also, the non-discrimination part would also hopefully deal with the concept of doctors determining what's medically necessary versus insurance providers. And so, I mean, that comes into play to where even if a transgender person has health care, then you run up against the problem of, well, if a male to female person needs something related to prostate treatment, or if a female to male needs gynecological care, for that being denied as not being medically necessary because, they said it doesn't relate to the current gender.
I would like to share a quick anecdote with you along those lines. It's a story of a person, a male to female transsexual, who joined a lesbian softball team and broke her arm and could not receive care. Her insurance company declined to cover that injury because if she was not transgender, she could not be in a lesbian baseball team and therefore would not have broken her arm. I mean, so they'll find any other reason. And also with regards to that, and we didn't really talk about medically necessary care that the insurance non-discrimination bill would help. When I couldn't get insurance, I was offering, take transgender care out of it. I will pay for that. I will happily pay for that myself. I wanted to protect myself from cancer, from heart attack, from things that anybody could get, and they wouldn't even give me that. I didn't even broach the idea of medically necessary care for my gender transition. And those are issues that are happening. And to piggyback on something that Chuck said a little earlier with regards to business has picked up on that, and a great number of Fortune 500 companies not only allow for transgender people to be part of their insurance policy, but also that their transition medical expenses are covered within that policy, which is huge. And that's without statute.
As to your question about the Constitution, I don't think you can do sort of an omnibus thing in the Constitution, and the restrictions or the definition of marriage is something that specifically would have to be changed. But sort of to what we said before is, are we ready to go to a statewide ballot on that? No, we're not. We have work to do before we would try to make that happen, because you don't want to go to the ballot until you can win.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. This is all very complex, I see, as I listen to you. Do federal employment discrimination laws protect?
No.
I guess I would think they would, like from sexual harassment.
There is a part of I think Title VII at a federal level that deals with gender discrimination that has been interpreted as potentially affecting gender identity or expression.
Not 100%, though.
Yeah.
It's about 50-50, and it then becomes geographical, because it depends on which appellate circuit that those things have been argued on. So we had a really big win a couple of years ago, and Diane Schorer, who was given a job at the Library of Congress, and then informed her prospective or her new employers that she was transitioning. They rescinded the offer. She's highly qualified. She sued on the basis of Title VII and won, and that was a huge win for us. But in terms of gender identity or expression, it hasn't been proven 100% of the time. So therefore, it's really important to get our national ENDA, Employment Non-Discrimination Act, enacted into law as well.
Right. So that legislation is pending at the federal level as well. But
and of course, employers can always find other reasons to fire people, even if they aren't the real ones.
Correct.
We have another question, I think, from Dr. Phil Richardson.
Well, actually, this is more a comment. When the Texas Constitution amendment was out for public comment, I had the good fortune to go down and testify. There were 465, I think, people speaking against the amendment, and one person from that noted family values group of the Houston Petroleum Institute was in favor of it. And after a full day of testimony, the committee still came back and said, "Oh yes, we're in favor of this constitutional amendment." Would you comment on that?
That was part of a nationwide effort. I'm bipartisan. My organization is bipartisan. I'm just going to tell you the fact. That was part of a national plan by the Republican Party, and in that year, those types of laws were passed in 20 states, and it was in response to what was happening in Massachusetts, and they were determined to try and stop it. And so that was a coordinated campaign that targeted all state legislatures, and more than 20 of them passed similar laws. It was preordained that's what's going to happen.
Show you the power of lobbying, though.
Yeah, well, why even have the hearing if you aren't going to listen?
Because they're required by law to have the hearings.
Do we have any more questions? Douglas.
My question is, Equality Texas is, of course, a Texas-based organization. To what level do you work with national gay rights organizations, HRC or other ones?
We collaborate with national organizations to the extent that we are able. We're all independent organizations. Our work is not funded by HRC. Our work has to be funded by individual contributions from people here in Texas. All of the work that we do is within the state of Texas. We're focused solely on the Texas Legislature. So all of our efforts stay local to Texas, and so is our funding. We are currently we are collaborating currently with Human Rights Campaign on in San Antonio. San Antonio is one of those cities that doesn't have any form of they don't have any form of an ordinance prohibiting discrimination, and so there is a local coalition of people in San Antonio that are working to change that, and both Equality Texas and the Human Rights Campaign are a part of working with that coalition. So we do work together as we are able.
We're also part of a conglomerate of statewide LGBT organizations called the Equality Federation. So there's a lot of sharing of best practices. There's a lot of sharing of resources and things like that. Really on a formal basis, but it's very, very helpful to the work we do.
We have a question here. Would you say your name and stand, please?
Hello, my name is Mark. My question is based off the Hawaii statement from earlier and the U.S. amendment of holding all states accountable to other documents issued by all other states. I'm sure that's been tried, but since I'm not native to Texas and I'm still learning, since Hawaii has it, is there a way to force Texas down the path of, hey, you have to actually honor that?
That's specifically what some of the cases that are currently before the U.S. Supreme Court deal with, which is the 14th Amendment and giving equal recognition. Fair faith and credit. I can't think of the words. That is a specific part of one or more of the cases that are currently pending before the Supreme Court, and could be then could be cited as a reason why other states need to recognize the laws of other states.
Which has been the question since the very first state passed marriage equality. It's like, what are the other? Does Texas won't recognize a marriage from Iowa, and does that defy the fair faith and credit of the United States?
We have time, I think, for one last quick question. Gary Bennett.
I'm curious about the changes in public sentiment in Texas. It strikes me that it does not follow the same demographic trends that are leading to progressive victories elsewhere. What in the polling you've seen has represented the groups that have changed the most dramatically in the last few years in their attitudes towards these issues?
Sure. 2010 was the first polling that we had ever done on a statewide basis. And like I said, other than the two questions that dealt with marriage, there was already majority support for all the other issues that we deal with in terms of family recognition, employment non-discrimination, accurate birth certificates. That support was already there. The support for marriage was less than 50%. The updated polling to 2013 now has majority support for every question other than should Texans get married. But that one is something like 49.9% said yes and 49.3% said no. So it's a plurality but not a majority. Most of the other issues remained strong. There wasn't a lot of jump in support. The marriage questions were where the big jumps were. And there were greater than 10% increases in support for the freedom to marry among African Americans, among people under the age of 30, and among people over the age of 65.
Would you take just a couple minutes to perhaps summarize? And again, we thank you for a wonderfully informative presentation.
Thanks very much for having us here today. We have a bill tracking report that is on our website that we update mostly daily. Sometimes it doesn't get done every day. But it lists there all the pieces of legislation that we are tracking that we support or oppose. All of this information is at equalitytexas.org. All of this information is under the tab that says legislation. And again, thank you so very much for having us.
Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause for our speakers.